Now, Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, co-author of News Verdicts, The Debates, and Presidential Campaigns, as well as The Politics of Disenchantment, Bush, Clinton, Perot, and the Press, on Twitter at Dr. B. Rosenberg. Professor, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Can we talk about pardon power a bit?
Oh, sure.
How do we get pardon power? Where do we derive it? How did the founders decide to include pardon power as one of the major presidential prerogatives?
Well, the power of pardon is actually part of this general concept of clemency. And clemency basically has 5 different forms in the United States today: pardons, amnesty, commutation, remission of fines and forfeitures, and reprieve. And we're hearing about it right now because of the recent act by President Trump to commute the sentence of Roger Stone. What's kind of interesting is that the description of what's happened with Robert Stone is often called a pardon, but actually it's a commutation, which means that it's a form of clemency where the criminal punishment is reduced, but it doesn't change the fact that there was actually a conviction. If you go back historically, what you can go back to is the time around the 5th century where the Romans used the process as a kind of a form of a popularity contest for someone who had done some wrong. It was a way that both in Rome and in Athens, when pardons were used, it was a power of the state to sort of grant a reprieve of some sort to someone who had done a wrong. If you continue on with the English had a perspective that said that basically the king could do no wrong, so whatever the king said was fine, and if the king wanted to pardon someone, that was just fine as well.
So we get, that seems like a touch ironic that the founders would be reliant on a sort of monarchical precedent then.
Yeah, well, the idea was that they had to have something in place to allow in our case, the president, to have a method of remedy for something that was done by the courts, which was considered quite egregious. And in fact, in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it gives the power, the pardon to the president for offenses against the United States, but it says except in the cases of impeachment. And what we're seeing with a number of these situations is that the issue of a pardon or other types of clemency only revolves around the use of lifting the penalty for federal crimes, and that's why a lot of people are looking very closely, for example, at the recent Supreme Court decision about Donald Trump's taxes in terms of whether or not he could not only be gone after in federal court but also in state court, where no pardon would be available either in the form of a self-pardon or another president issuing a pardon for him.
Talking to Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. You can find him on Twitter at Dr. B. Rosenberg. I'm doubling back here, but can you flesh out the popularity contest part of the situation in ancient times? What does that mean?
Well, what happened was that the power structure at the time would be able to determine whether or not someone was going to get a pardon or not. And I think in my reading of history is that the leader, the king, the sovereign power could look to see how the public viewed the case and then make a decision about whether or not they ought to grant that pardon. In fact, there were provisions in early history that allowed people to sign petitions in which if you got like 6,000 signatures, you could get a pardon for an individual. Now, the reality is that the only way someone would be in that type of position is if they were a very influential person in the society, an athlete, perhaps a warrior or an orator who could gain enough popular support. If we take that same notion today, we can see it applied to our situation with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is often looking to public opinion to decide how he's going to flush out these pardons or acts of clemency. And I think he has made a decision that says, look, if it's going to increase my support among my base, which essentially is his form of a popularity contest, he's going to do it. He is, when he gave this pardon, for example, to Roger Stone the other day, excuse me, I said pardon again, it should be a commutation. He knew that he was going to rally his base, but at the same time, he was going to incense those people that are not supporters. And I think he's made a calculation that he's more concerned about motivating his base to be supportive and make sure that they're going to show up on Election Day than to worry about people who are not supporters of his and weren't going to vote for him anyway.
Yeah, and they come together nicely, because one thing I hear from Trump supporters is that in their estimation, he makes the right people angry.
Right. Well, the strategy for re-election for Donald Trump, you would have thought would be to increase his base and move beyond sort of a minority vote and still win the Electoral College. He seems to be doubling down on the fact that he's going to really increase his support, mobilize his support for those who are going to turn out on Election Day, and as a result, win various states, even if it's by narrow margins, to win the Electoral College, and not worry about enlarging his base because he feels that in many ways those people are lost to him anyway.
Professor, how does having his sentence commuted rather than getting a pardon, how does that affect Roger Stone?
Well, what that means is that he has made a sort of a semi-public declaration that he was guilty of something. And in fact, in some of the news articles, when he's been interviewed since the announcement, he said, I could have flipped on the president, and if I would have flipped on him, it would have been easier for me, but I didn't, and I continued to support the president. So he is, in effect, publicly saying that he was guilty of acts that were illegal. But he also had to accept that for a judge for him to be able to get his form of clemency. So when we saw a sort of remarkable news conference the other day when Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller went out and said Stone was prosecuted and convicted because he committed federal crimes, he remains a convicted felon, and rightly so. Basically, what he's saying is that there's not a question about whether or not he was guilty or not. He did commit crimes. Whether or not the president is going to let him off of the sentence, which would have included time in jail, which, by the way, was going to happen rather soon, but because of this form of clemency, he's not actually going to have to go to jail. There are other people that are sort of waiting in the wings, though, we have to recognize, that are in sort of similar situations, and that principal person would be Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort has been convicted. He did not receive any type of clemency before going to jail. He did get originally the thought of a reduced sentence if he was going to cooperate, and then he doubled down and stopped cooperating. So he's sitting in a jail right now. He is also a candidate potentially for Donald Trump to issue a pardon or clemency or some other form of reduction of penalty if he so chooses. And it'll be interesting to see if that happens, and if it does happen, when it happens, whether it happens before the election or after the election.
Professor, just stop me short if this calls for irresponsible speculation, but why would the president commute Roger Stone's sentence rather than pardoning him?
It seems like the conversation that's sort of leaking out is that even in the White House there were several people, including Attorney General Barr, who were opposed to granting a pardon to Roger Stone. So I think that became sort of a point for the president to weigh back and forth about whether he was going to give a complete and total pardon for any acts that Roger Stone did, or simply to remove the prison sentence. The stain is still there. And I think in many ways Roger Stone doesn't really care. Roger Stone just didn't want to go to jail. So even the media, when it covers the story, often says that there's been a pardon for Roger Stone. In fact, that's not what the case is. And, it's kind of interesting from a historical perspective. Other pardons that have been issued, for example, the pardon of Richard Nixon by Ford was actually a complete pardon. He couldn't be prosecuted for any acts that he did while he was in office. What was interesting was that it was a very controversial act, and Ford basically decided that he was going to run for president, was defeated, but throughout his life he carried in his wallet a little piece of paper that was his justification for pardoning Nixon, which was a description of the 1915 Supreme Court decision that says, in the case of Burdick versus the United States, that a pardon carries an imputation of guilt and that its acceptance carries a confession of guilt. So he used that process saying, I'm giving him a pardon, but he essentially is going to have acknowledged that he was guilty of an act. Not too much later, after he had lost the election, we saw that Jimmy Carter, the next president, came in, and while he could do nothing about the pardon that was given to Nixon, decided to provide a form of clemency in which he removed any penalty for anyone who dodged the draft with Vietnam. So presidents use this power. Usually it's kind of selective. It's not in all cases. If you think back to George W. Bush, he received about, I think the number was in the thousands, and he ended up giving out about 200 pardons. We often hear these pardons or other forms of clemency talked about a lot. Also, for example, with Bill Clinton and Mark Rich. So it's a powerful tool available to the president, but we also have to recognize that many times there's nothing you can do when this decision comes down. I should just make a quick point. I know we're running out of time,
Yep.
But with Michael Flynn, there's no pardon that's necessary. And that's a sort of a different path that's been taken by Trump and Attorney General Barr, because they were successful at getting the charges dropped. So hence there was no conviction, even though he had pled guilty. So what we see is pardons only, or other forms of penalty, only come in after a conviction is granted. In the Michael Flynn case, since the charges were removed by the Justice Department, there was no need to actually have a pardon. So he can never claim that he was declared innocent, because there was technically never a judicial determination on that.
Dr. William Rosenberg is a professor of political science at Drexel University and co-author of News Verdicts, The Debates, and Presidential Campaigns, as well as The Politics of Disenchantment, Bush, Clinton, Perot, and the Press, tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg. Professor, thanks very much.